Good evening, everybody. Thank you very much, Humphrey, for a very lucid and articulate vision of the whole possibilities of conflagration in, I don't know what area it is. It's East Asia is probably too small to describe it, but anyway, I'm sure you appreciated that a lot. At the very beginning, he mentioned about principles, and what Universal Peace Federation is, probably more than any other single thing to describe it, is an organization that has a very clear sense of the principles that lead away from conflict and towards harmony and peaceful resolution of issues. And what we try to do is actually to help to resolve conflicts. I can say we have had notable success in one or two instances. We're still working on a lot of others. In Nepal, for example, you probably know that there was for many years a civil war, a state of civil war between basically the Maoist guerrillas, which had a hold over about 3 million of the population, and the rest of the country. Anyway, it's a very long story, and I could spend all my time talking about that and not do a very good job. So I won't go into it in great detail, but what I wanted to say is that basically there has been, using these principles, has been already very significant success. If you talk to any of the past presidents and prime ministers of Nepal, as I've spoken to many of them have come to our conferences partly because of what we could do in their country. They are one in saying that UPF, and particularly Father Moon, our founder, was very much instrumental in bringing about the peace that now exists in Nepal. Of course, you know, peace can last a short time or a long time. There's no guarantee it will last forever, but many people in Nepal anyway think that they've turned the corner and that they have entered an era of peace as a result. The point is really to understand proper principles. And I would just like to outline a few of those to you this evening in the context that Humphrey so very articulately explained them to us. The first one is, and forgive me for doing this because we are not in a war zone here in the UK, but I think we're all very well aware of things that are going on in our country: conflicts, tensions, divisions, fragmentation or possible fragmentation. And therefore I think we can probably best understand these principles in our own context. I'm not saying there's any danger of war, as I said, but these same principles, if not applied, can lead to war, especially in areas like the one that Humphrey has been talking to us about. And one of the most important principles is, when you're dealing with world affairs, is to be sure to always put the highest level first. In other words, we all put the good of humanity before the good of our own nation. We put the good of our nation before our own interests. There are certain very well understood, very commonsensical principles that should be the stuff of global affairs, should be the bread and butter of every politician's life, but unfortunately are not. And we've seen that in the UK recently, because we had a referendum debate about whether we should be part of the EU or not. And I'm not going to even tell you my position on that, but some of you will, I'm sure, be able to guess. But the point about it was that from a UPF perspective, both sides very strongly departed from principles. In other words, putting often the lower level of concern above the higher. So why did we have a referendum in the first place? Was not for the greater good and glory of this country, but it was to solve issues in one particular political party and divisions between factions in that political party. And now we see the result that this country is incredibly divided. And that's what happens if you put lower principles or lower levels of concern above higher ones. You open up all kinds of possibilities for conflict. And this is something that we are experiencing now. We could say that the referendum debate that was had, and as I said, I think there was very serious failings on both sides. We had on the Remain side, we had this Project Fear, which turned everybody off. And on the Brexit side, we had all kinds of now acknowledged untruths. And the one thing that was never discussed in the referendum debate, and this is very, very important to understand as a general principle in world affairs, the one thing that wasn't ever discussed, I never heard anybody mention it. The nearest I heard was when one Green Party leader talked about how actually the European Union had maybe done some good in the past. That was the nearest I heard about on this principle. But the main principle is what is for the good of the whole. This nation is, as every nation, is part of a global community of nations. We are all nationals or residents or whatever we are of this country, but we're also at least potentially global citizens. And the important thing is, in the whole referendum debate, I never heard any discussion of what's good for Europe and what's good for the world. All that we heard about was what's good for Britain, what's in our own self-interest. And even more so now, you hear discussions about how we can, in spite of what's happened, we can secure our own self-interest. But the most important thing is that we are in a global age. Whatever we think of globalization, however we view it, we've got to deal with global affairs first, the good of humanity first, and our own self-interest or perceived self-interest after that. And this is one thing that's been very seriously wrong. And this, of course, applies to everything that Humphrey was talking about, to the role of China. Is China advancing its own interests only in Southeast Asia or the rest of the world, or is China thinking about the good of humanity? Well, I leave you to answer that question for yourselves. If you think back to the whole Syria debate in the United Nations in the era of Barack Obama, when he was trying to bring some influence to bear on the Syrian regime after the terrible atrocities that there had been in that country, it was after all China and Russia who intervened at the United Nations to stop any kind of concerted global action to limit the damage in Syria and to try to bring peace in Syria. Remember, Hillary Clinton called it unconscionable. Well, I think whatever you think of Hillary Clinton, I think most people would agree with that. To use your veto in the Security Council for very selfish purposes, Russia to try to secure its own interest, Syria being its only foothold in the Middle East, to try to use Syria as a way of keeping some kind of prestige and some kind of influence for itself in the Middle East, rather than thinking of the interests of the Syrian people or Middle Eastern people. This was a very clear case, again, of putting the nation's own interest above the global interest or the interest of the wider humanity. And so we can see that no nation, our own nation, no other nation is above doing this sort of thing. But if we're really going to get a grasp of world affairs, and if we're going to really get a handle on peace, we really need to take this point deeply to heart. Because basically, nations are no different than people in the sense of being actors on the world stage. And Father Moon used to teach about this very, very strongly, that we have to see nations just the same way that we see people. The nation, in individual relations between people, what do people react to? They react to not just the words that the person is saying to them or the actions that the person is taking in relation to them, but to the heart with which they're doing it. Do you care about me, or are you just caring about yourself? That's one of the key things. Well, it's really no different in international affairs. And what we need to see is that nations need to be aware of what is the heart and what is the attitude that my nation is showing to other nations or to particular other nations. And you saw, some terrible examples. In Britain, we pride ourselves, we tend to pride ourselves on, we've had this glorious history, but as Humphrey pointed out, if you look at, for example, the Opium Wars in China in the middle to late 19th century, this was a really shameful episode, as he so clearly pointed out. We went in the guise of high principle to do some very low deeds. And of course now the repercussions are coming a century or more later. So it's very, very important that not just great statesmen or politicians or whatever understand these principles, but we as ordinary people need to be very aware, as ones who can influence politicians, just how important it is that my nation sends out the right vibration, not just the right words, not just the empty phrases used at the UN General Assembly, but in terms of word and deed, and above all in terms of heart, how we relate towards other nations. And if we can prevail on our politicians, and if every nation can do the same, to always be considering the greater good before simply our own good. Of course we have to think of our own self-interest. I'm not pretending we can just ignore our own self-interest. But we do need to be aware of the wider and overarching interests of humanity even before our own self-interest. This is very fundamental and something that UPF very much stands for. So what I wanted to close with is just to talk about one example of this, because actually, honestly speaking, individuals or NGOs, civil society, whatever you want to call it, is often better at doing good than states. There are very clear reasons for this, because very often states are subject to, for example, democratic or other pressures that stop them from doing the right thing. The majority is not always right by any means. Very often the majority is wrong. The majority wants a smaller thing, and the right thing to do is to do a larger thing with a greater heart. And so therefore civil society initiatives are extremely important, because through them a kind of heart can be expressed between peoples that very often it cannot be freely expressed between nations. And I think Father Moon understood this more than any other person of our age anyway, probably of any other age. And I want to explain that by just briefly explaining about what he has done and did do in his lifetime. Now his wife is carrying on that same effort, same initiative, to try to bring peace in North Korea, between North and South Korea, because he saw, as long as I knew him anyway, from the 1970s onwards, he was always talking about, you know, there's going to come a time when there's going to be potential conflagration between North and South Korea, when there will be a face-off, which we will either resolve in a peaceful way, in a harmonious way, or it could spell disaster, not just for those two countries, but for all of East Asia, as Humphrey hinted, or even for the whole world. You probably read recently that even if what's the intelligence that's coming out of North Korea is correct, it's even theoretically possible that the missiles that they're now developing could reach London. It's not impossible anyway. So you can see that there is definitely the potential for global conflagration in North and South Korea. But understanding this, Father Moon said from the 1970s onwards that he felt that he had to take responsibility. He said, I understand this. I'm from North Korea myself. I've lived most of my life in South Korea. I understand the nature of the regime in the North better than anyone. And therefore, I have to lay the foundations for when that time comes, whenever it is, in decades' time, that peace is still possible, even though everything else looks like war. So what he did was to set about launching many different projects, all under a single umbrella of a peace initiative, Northeast Asia Peace Initiative. And there were many, many facets to this. If I had an hour, I couldn't go into all the things, but very, very significant exchanges, like, for example, cultural exchanges. You probably know that he founded an organization called the Little Angels of Korea, who are the official cultural ambassadors of South Korea. They've been here to the UK and performed many times, and they have done around the world. Anyway, he sent them to North Korea to perform, and he welcomed the equivalent in North Korea to the south. And both of these exchanges made a great impact. He also had sport exchanges. He arranged a soccer match with a Brazilian soccer team in the national stadium in Pyongyang in North Korea, so that the North Korean soccer team had a very attractive team to play against in front of 150,000 people in that arena. He arranged student exchanges, bringing young Korean students from the north to China and then meeting their counterparts with American and Western and also Asian students as well for exchanges, so that North Korean students wouldn't be holed up in this hermit kingdom and think that the only reality was the reality that they experienced in their own country. But there were many, many alternative ways that they could take. Here he built business exchanges, so he had a car factory built in North Korea. The only car industry that North Korea's had to date is the one that Father Moon arranged to be built in North Korea, which produced all the cars basically that now drive on the roads of North Korea. He had built an international hotel, which was still is, as far as I know, the place where most international people who come to the north, to Pyongyang, stay. Huge pyramid of a building called the Potonggang Hotel. He arranged tourism for people from the south to be able to go to the north for tourism in Mount Kumgang. He did all kinds of projects of this kind over a 40-year period. The most astonishing thing that he did was, and it's actually very hard to grasp or digest the depth of this and the dimensions of this in terms of courage, in terms of heart, in terms of so many key aspects, is that he arranged himself to go to North Korea in 1991, the end of 1991. Now, to understand that, you have to understand that he was, until that time, pilloried in North Korea as public enemy number one, because he was denouncing communism. He was saying communism is false, communism has no future, and especially has no future in North Korea. Therefore, North Korea should give up communism. And I think it's well documented by the CIA and other intelligence organizations that on numerous occasions, dozens of occasions, the North Korean regime tried to assassinate Father Moon. One time the Lincoln Tunnel in New York was blocked off by the FBI, and they intercepted a truck, which was basically a giant truck bomb that was being driven north of New York to Reverend Moon's home, where it was to be detonated and to eliminate him. That was the kind of fearsome opposition that he faced from North Korea. But yet in the face of this, he said, I have to go to North Korea because Kim Il-sung is a very evil man, but he's my brother. And the only way to solve this crisis, this threat to humanity, is in the realm of heart. If he feels loved, if he knows that other people love him, if I can embrace him as my brother, then we can avert war. This is the secret. Anyway, so cutting a very long story short, in 1991, he went there. He was welcomed as the most extraordinarily important visitor that North Korea had ever had. Can't go into all the details, but with incredible motorcades, and the whole parliament convened to meet him and all this kind of thing. No, the world knows nothing of this. If you don't come to UPF meetings, you don't know, unless you're Humphrey Hawksley, you don't know about this kind of thing. But this is literally true. And he went, first of all, to the parliament, and everybody thought he would mouth a few platitudes like you've heard over the last few days in the UN, and fairly meaningless and empty phrases. But actually he tore in to Judaism, which is the ideology of the North, in front of the whole parliament, which was all basically stooges of the regime. None of them were elected. And he said, Judaism is evil. It's wrong. You should get rid of it. It's going to destroy you. It's not going to do any good for you. And he went on and on and on like this, very, very strongly. There's even some footage that can be seen where he's doing this. And everybody thought, this man's a dead man. He's not going to get out of this building alive, because anybody who shows even that much opposition to the North Korean regime is automatically either sent to a camp or eliminated. We've all heard those stories. Unfortunately, most of them are true. So even those around him were very fearful. They came to support him, but they thought they were all going off to some unspeakable place. Anyway, instead they were taken directly to Kim Il-sung's private home, miniature palace where he used to hold court. And again, I'm afraid I can't show you the video because it just isn't time, but you can actually see videos of this. They meet each other and they embrace each other like long lost brothers. This literally did happen. And this made the most profound impact on Kim Il-sung, who was the founding president, the originator of this awful regime, one of the most unspeakable regimes in human history that's ever existed. And they sat talking for hours and they talked about collaboration and cooperation, and many projects came out of it. Anyway, to cut a very long story short, since that time, there has been a very, very special bond between Father Moon and Mother Moon and their family and the Kim family. And it's not the kind of bond you'd expect. It's not a sort of a cronies kind of bond, but there is the most profound respect that has been shown continuously, right down to this year actually, by the successors of Kim Il-sung, his son Kim Jong-il, and then more latterly Kim Jong-un, who's now what Donald Trump calls Rocket Man in North Korea. It's very, very hard to understand. It's really, really hard to understand this fact, but it is a fact, and it's actually known by the foreign ministries of Europe, because many people have told us. Robin Marsh has had this experience. He met with David Miliband, our former foreign minister, well, when he was still foreign minister. I have met foreign ministers from different parts of Europe and officials of foreign ministries, and they all say, yes, it's funny, I don't understand it, but your movement has some kind of special relationship or something with the North, and they cannot begin to grasp what it is and the impact it has had in keeping peace, but also can have in the future. And so even down to, when Father Moon passed away in 2012, Kim Jong-il, who was then the father of the present president, sent, actually no, he welcomed Reverend Moon's son to North Korea and bestowed on him as a representative of his father this Grand Reunification Prize, which is the highest award that North Korea can give to someone in relation to the whole reunification issue. And anyway, since then there have been gifts and greetings and all kinds of signs of great respect. And this is intact. So when I hear and when we see Donald Trump in his bellicose rhetoric and threatening to rain all hellfire down on North Korea and eliminate it from this earth and all this kind of stuff, obviously we realize that he doesn't understand that there is this kind of very special back channel that exists, and which we believe will ultimately lead to a solution, because successive generations of the Kim family have inherited this sense of profound respect for Father Moon and his wife. And anyway, there is, I can't go into it again in detail, but actually in their ambassador, our UPF's ambassador to North Korea, in effect, a man called Park Sang-kwon, whom I think Humphrey has met. He is now one of the most celebrated and most well-known people in South Korea, because every time he comes back from the north, from one of his visits on our behalf, he's literally besieged by the media at the airport and whatever, and immediately debriefed by the Korean Ministry of Unification, reunification, as to exactly what's been going on and what's happening. And he's the man considered to know best in South Korea really what is the true state of the North Korean regime and what they're really thinking about whatever. So anyway, I really don't have long enough. Robin is dying. He's going to pull a lever in a moment and the trapdoor is going to open. I'm going to disappear. But I don't have time to explain in more depth why there is this very hopeful thing. But I can assure you it's building all the time. From Europe, we have started a project to send medical supplies to North Korea completely unconditionally, although we do ask for it to be monitored and to be, to get proper feedback on the usage. And there are many things going on too, through soft power, to try to end this conflict. And I believe that at the end of the day, it will be the logic of love, which somebody, I don't know whether it was Humphrey, touched upon before, rather than the logic of power, which will prevail in North Korea. It's very, very hard to get your mind around this, especially hearing it for the first time, I'm sure. But I'd be very happy to share more about it on some other occasion. But we believe deeply that the way forward in human affairs is not weapons and guns and warfare of any kind, but it is the logic of the heart. If you can truly embrace and love your enemy, whether it's your next door neighbor who drives you to distraction by playing loud music at 2 o'clock on a summer morning, or it's some head of some foreign state that is threatening your country, it doesn't make any difference actually. Every single human being ultimately is vulnerable in the best sense to love. And if they feel loved by you, they are much more likely to listen to you than anyone else and to be open to your suggestions. And I believe that this is the hope for North and South Korea, the hope for Asia. And on some future occasion, I wish I could explain more about it, but it really is a reality that is helping to keep the peace at this time, which I believe will ultimately lead to a lasting, peaceful solution for the Korean Peninsula. Thank you very much.